Man, what a great town, man. I'm in the wrong city. I should be moving down here. Man, this town rocks. No, I'm serious, man. This town rocks. This is, again, man, I'm real lucky. I've been able to travel all over, but I've never been to Roanoke. This is my first time. So it's a real, and again, I think it's probably the prettiest day in the history of Roanoke today. So thank you all for hanging in, mad props for rolling this late. It's funny looking out this, it's almost like being in a Virgin Airlines jet, the colors we got going here. Before we get going, I just want to let you know, profanity is the jazz of the Irish. In my enthusiasm, every once in a while, I drop the F-bomb. I don't do it at anybody. I don't use it as a verb, but you get my point. I try not to. My mother really worked me hard, but just so you know, I roll fast and I get really enthusiastic about what I'm talking about. So no disrespect. I'll try and be civil. In D.C., where I live, and where I have lived for many years, I've been called many things. I've been called a jerk, a shameless self-promoter, a bomb thrower, and a loose cannon. And I'm probably all of those things. But if I could self-identify, I'd pick 4 other things. The first is I'm a recovering hypocrite. When I was 10 in 1968, the year that Dr. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. And 10 is about that age where the world starts to open up. And you realize it's not, Saturday morning cartoons or the world that your parents kind of insulate you from. You start to see it for what it is. And 68 was a tough year to kind of see the world as it is. But I must admit, I was really, really floored by those 2 assassinations. Because in effect, to my young eyes, the notion that these 2 young men were murdered over the concept of what our country could do if we move beyond race, if we move beyond class or generations and work together. To a 10-year-old, this seemed like, filing under D for duh. This is good business. But nonetheless, as I looked out in America at that time, streets were, really on fire, literally. And America was tearing itself apart. Now, interesting enough, a couple of months later, my parents had a party. And, it was one of those peek between the banister moments where you watch your parents and, you're kind of laughing at the way they dance and stuff. But I realized as I watched that everybody in this room, all of my parents' friends and contemporaries in the neighborhood, were all dancing to music that said pretty much the exact same thing that Robert Kennedy and Dr. King were saying. And I became really intrigued. I remember sitting there and thinking, speeches, words cause deep anger, frustration, conflict. Music creates openness, tolerance, joy. So I became really, 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 really intrigued by the power of music. Now, this was, as I mentioned, in Los Angeles, and my father was a Marine Corps officer, so we moved quite a bit. And we ended up moving from Southern California, where we'd lived in 3 different places. And I was 13, and I was really, had a very, very keen understanding of where I was going to go at age 13 in Southern California. But unfortunately, my father got transferred, and we ended up in Springfield, Virginia. So this was a little bit like the Beverly Hillbillies in reverse. And I was deeply, deeply depressed by this turn of affairs. And my mother and I sat down and we watched this movie Casablanca together. She thought this would really cheer me up. And it really did. I mean, but what's wild about it is, again, this is one of these moments that we all have. Speaking of big ideas, where I watched this place and the setup of the story, people are flooding into Rick's, basically trying to grab a hold of the freedom of just a night out. These are men and women who have been refugees. Everything they know is gone. But they can go to Rick's and almost pretend that the world is still the same. It's still Paris or Antwerp or Belgium or wherever they're from. But as you get into the intimacy of the crowd, it's one of my favorite pieces of cinematography. It goes from the corners of the club down into the intimacy of conversations. And as the camera kind of goes through the crowd, you really realize as people whisper to one another, they're all talking about, how do I get out of Casablanca to the deeper freedom of America? So I was really, again, I was 13, I was watching this, it's like, wow, this club is operating on 2 levels. I mean, there's freedom at 2 different levels. So there's, again, the immediacy of now, that's all you want. If that's all you can handle. But if you really want something deeper, more powerful, it's there too. you know, and you could make a case that what you saw was not really the function. You know, what you saw was really almost just the disguise for the larger liberating machine. So that's when I really decided as a young man that I had no interest in school. I was going to open the greatest nightclub in the world. And that's all I wanted to do, man. I could not even remotely pay attention in school because, again, all I wanted to do was explore the power of music. Again, now, I have to acknowledge here very quick, I have a high level of confidence, and it is very much important to acknowledge that so much of that is born because I was born a white man in America. So there was never, ever, ever, ever any limits placed on my sense of accomplishment, what I could achieve. So like many young white men in America, I had this enthusiastic sense of I could change the world. So what I wanted to do, though, was use music, theater, art, dance, comedy to help people who clearly, as I go into my parents' dancing, were afraid of ideas. But these ideas were imperative that we talked about it. You know, I didn't want to let go of this 10-year-old's vision of the world, this 10-year-old's kind of sense of optimism and excitement about what the world could be. But I understood the power of, and almost the need sometimes to disguise these tough ideas as something else that just gives people a momentary way to get in. So for me, the nightclub wasn't about booking bands or selling liquor and that stuff. You know, that's what you had to do to make money. I wanted to put on shows. And again, you have to understand, for those younger in the audience, I came up in an era where you saw variety shows on television, Smothers Brothers, Flip Wilson, you know, all these shows, and you tuned in because you were going to be entertained. You almost didn't know who was going to be on, but you trusted them that they would entertain you. And so that's what I wanted to do. It was almost like Ziegfeld. I wanted to put on shows. So now, I did this really well. I mean, this was my college. I studied it with a young man's fervor. I was going to change the world, and I was going to put on dynamic shows and really, again, in the nation's capital, lure people into discussions or ideas that they were afraid to have. Well, life goes on, you know, and I'm just rocking through D.C., and suddenly, as you all know, in the 1980s, homelessness really started to appear. Now, again, for you younger people in the audience, I feel bad because you've grown up with this. And there were always people on the outside. But the notion that you were going to see people sleeping out behind the White House or near the Capitol, this was very new. Now, there were always, again, people on the fringe, and you started seeing men at first, but then you started seeing women. And then suddenly, tragically, families. This was very new and very, very confusing for many people, including myself. And I would walk to work at night, going to my nightclubs or whatever, and I would see people, and I would really try my best to make eye contact, you know, and just kind of acknowledge people, but there was a distance, a very purposeful distance. And then one night, a group of people asked if I wanted to go out and feed the homeless. And I said no. I had no, you know, I was, like many people, I was pretending I was too busy, I had other things to do, but I was just nervous. I didn't want, you know, I was afraid of this. I was burdened by the stereotype of what I would encounter. You know, so here I was, my entire young life, dreaming of changing the world, dreaming of using the power of music to bring people together. Yet here I was asked to go out in my own backyard and feed people. And I tried every which way to get out of it. Now, don't worry, this isn't a Paul on the way to Damascus story, but I ended up going, and on the way out, you know, on this kind of van, bumping along Pennsylvania Avenue, trying to avoid revealing my nervousness, I started making conversation. You know, where's the food come from? You know, and they're like, well, it's purchased at the Safeway in Georgetown, which, as you may know, is probably one of the most expensive stores on the eastern seaboard. And I'm thinking to myself, well, now this is interesting because the industry I work in, we throw away food every night. And not just us, but a bunch of my friends who didn't particularly want to work in, they just wanted to make some money. They left the nightclub restaurant world and went to work in catering. And back then in the 1980s in DC, it was roast beef and shrimp and keep it coming with the caterers. So they were lamenting the fact, a girlfriend of mine had actually mentioned a couple of weeks earlier that they had thrown away like 12 legs of lamb one night because a very small amount of people showed up. And again, from the business model, it was already paid for. You know, there was no room back at the catering office for the legs of lamb because there was tomorrow's food there. And so this was just part of the food cycle at the time. Now, don't get me wrong, restaurant people, caterers aren't laughing maniacally and throwing legs of lamb in the dumpster. You know, it pains them, but this was the business model. And it was part of the American culture that suggested that there's plenty where that came from. It's cheap. Don't worry about it. You know, so I'm aware of that side. But what got really interesting is, as we pulled up, I'm not here, by the way, as we pulled around in front of the State Department, and I'm getting nervous because here comes the magic moment. I'm peeking out this window, this big step van, right? And I'm kind of peering out to see what I'm getting into. And I see almost like the view from here, you see silhouettes, heads going around the corner and up the street. And it was a rainy night. You know, not a pouring rain, but a good, solid wet, you know. And here were these people waiting for this truck to show up. You know, and we dutifully started, slid open the window and started serving people, you know. And the immediacy of the conversations was really pretty captivating. I mean, very quickly my stereotypes, I was kind of unburdened, if you will. And I had some really decent conversations, but I couldn't help overhear as people went down the line and they got the lentil soup and the banana and the cookies and the bread and all these other things. At the other end of the line, standing in the back of everybody, whoops, sorry about that. Time waits for no man. The driver of the truck knew everybody by name and was calling out to everybody, see you tomorrow night, see you tomorrow night, see you tomorrow night. And I'm sitting there trying to mind my own business, being a good volunteer, but I just kept thinking about this and watching people kind of wander off with all the stuff we'd given them off into this misty night. And I kept thinking, wow, what happens now? I mean, I know that somehow in 24 hours they'll be back here again, and somebody else will do this. And again, a lot of the comments I'm going to make today are not disrespectful, not intended to malign, but what I realized in that moment was that I was the one being served. That in effect, and this is a big part of my theme, is that charity in America is based more on the redemption of the giver than the liberation of the receiver. And that's kind of what really hit me that day. And I went back to this idea of this 10-year-old's sense of justice and opportunity and equal access. So I started thinking about this, and I came back a couple weeks later with a business plan based on FedEx. Again, for you younger men and women in the audience who've grown up with it, FedEx was not only a brand new thing, but it was a very, very strange idea. Fred Smith, who I had the honor of just meeting, his business plan was for $10. If you had to get a letter from Roanoke to Charlotte, Fred Smith said his business plan was someone will come up in a truck, pick up your letter, take it to the airport, fly it to Memphis, Tennessee, someone will sort it, they'll put it on another plane, fly it to Charlotte, put it on a truck, drive it up, deliver it the next morning for $10. All that for $10. So on paper, like many big ideas, it looked crazy, but it worked. So I just proposed FedEx for food. If you could get restaurants, hotels, hospitals, farmers, all of these different places, again, people who love food and hated to throw away, but they just didn't want to get sued. So if you could provide a health code alternative, i.e. a refrigerated truck, you could access all this amazing food and you can feed more people better food for less money. But the idea really struck me that what happens if you could offer men and women a chance to come in out of the rain and be part of the solution too? And you could almost remove the false barrier. And I'm fascinated by false barriers. Again, stages, I think, are interesting barriers in a way, but that's another discussion. But, the idea that the system was somebody with a job served the poor. What would it be like if we could bring everybody around to the same side of the table, and begin to explore the power of community? This idea that you can work side by side, and that's what I proposed. And, the idea was not only can you do all this other great stuff cheaper, faster, better, but you can shorten the line by the very way you serve it, and then you can actually repay, if you will, the men and women who donated the food to you, the restaurateurs. You could repay them with men and women who were certified food handlers, people who were ready to show up on time, help them make money. Everybody would win. The great quid pro quo, the Latin term, good business. Everybody benefits. So as you can imagine, I showed up and I asked if we could assemble all the different groups. It took turns going out each night to serve people with this truck. And I made my presentation. And the reason I'm so long-winded about this, and this is particularly aimed at for young men and women in the audience, and frankly for anybody who has a big idea, that sometimes, no matter how long you live, it can be difficult to deal with the fact that sometimes you've thought it through, you've thought of every possible question, you're prepared for everything, yet people don't necessarily take your idea. I thought for sure I was going to be the volunteer of the year. I was completely sure, but, and again, like any good business plan, I was prepared for certain questions, but what really floored me was how, as I could answer just about everything, that clearly people were getting a little bit more uncomfortable, and someone said, look, we know you mean well, but you're really naive to think you can train the homeless. And that one really took me back, because again, I was a shameless nightclub profiteer. I mean, I want to change the world, but I thought this was your gig, by any means necessary, you know? And I was just really upset and kind of taken aback. And then I realized they're not going to do this. And this is where, and I'm sure many of you have had this moment where your road splits, you know, and there's no sign that says polka dots and moonbeams. That way, I'd turn back if I were you. That way, it's just there, and you got to choose. Now, I'll be honest with you, I thought I could just get it going and go back to running nightclubs. But here we sit 25 years later, which brings me to the second word I describe myself as. I'm bona fide. You know, I'm a badass machine of loving jobs. I have done, I'm really honestly excited, happy, thrilled by what our team has been able to accomplish over the last few years. We've produced 27,000 meals in DC. We've been able to train, we just started our 90th class. 1,000 men and women have gone on to get jobs. We have 33 campus kitchens. We have a whole variety of things we've done. And again, I've been very, very lucky. I've been able to chair the Mayor's Commission on Nutrition. I was the founding chair of Street Sense, which is our homeless newspaper. I have had an amazing turn. But the awkward thing is, the third way I describe myself is I'm a futurist. You know, I went to a party when I was a kid, and I met this guy. And, you know, D.C. is one of those towns where people ask you what to do so they can determine whether they really have any interest in talking to you. And I met this guy, and I was like, you know, what are you doing? He goes, I'm a futurist. And I'm like, dude, what's that? You know, and he's like, no, dude, it's no big deal. It's just trends. And I'm like, I'm a futurist. You know, that really interests me. And this is what got very interesting about the kitchen, because I realized very early that hunger wasn't about food. I was just naive. I just assumed that hunger was about homelessness. We opened up on George Bush Sr.'s inauguration. Again, business 101. I come from showbiz. This is showbiz 101. You know, I knew that there was this urban myth that people still cling to sometimes, that it is illegal. The health department won't let you use that food. And actually, there's laws that facilitate it in every state now. And I was lucky enough to go to the Rose Garden in 1996 to watch Bill Clinton sign the Food Donor Donee Act, which became the first ever national law to shield all donors of liability. Again, it was this case of gross negligence. But you know, as I went forward and I started to kind of open my doors and kind of revel in the media that immediately came to the kitchen, I was shocked that the phone calls I got. Because what I started to hear from is my mother is at home and she has to choose between medicine and food, heating oil and food. Can you help? My kids at an after-school program, and I don't get home until 6, and there's no snack. Can you help? And literally within days of opening, my small little concept of hunger blew up. But what became really evident really quickly was that inadvertently, I had touched this wild nerve. That no matter where I went and explained what I did, as soon as I said, we take the food that used to be thrown away and we bring it back, and people immediately would almost stop. And what I didn't understand that I touched was this almost universal sense of guilt that Americans had about the amount of food we threw away every day. And this enthusiastic sense of, thank God somebody's doing something about it. Well, this has become very interesting because sometimes when you have a good idea, you know, when people respond to it, it's very tempting to try and kind of hoard all that energy. You know, but I came very aware because, again, I was in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, media that many other cities don't have. I guarantee you, there's people here in Roanoke that have done just as much powerful work as I have. There's people all over America. I've gotten credit mainly because I live in Washington, D.C., in a media-rich city. You know, and I've been able to get all kinds of amazing, I've met so many people, I've gotten awards, and in so many other cities, there's somebody's best gig is they're going to get a Lions Club plaque. You know, one year they're going to get a luncheon. And people will say, good job, you know. So I always felt somewhat obligated to use this stage that I had for the larger, greater good. Hence, opening up on George Bush Sr.'s inauguration, one donor. All it took was the President of the United States donating food left over from the inaugurations, and suddenly it became evident to everyone in the United States, you can actually use this food. The President of the United States just donated. There's no excuse. Anybody can. But early in my gig, I started to really become aware of aging in America. You know, about 1996, I became really intrigued by the fact that I did my first speech in front of people who did Meals on Wheels. And there was a waiting list in 1996 in half of American cities for Meals on Wheels. And I knew that in 10 years, 2006, the first baby boomer was going to turn 60, and that you were going to start to see a steady progress of older Americans coming. And I also knew that, again, trends, that with the birth of cable television and the explosion of cooking shows, ergo the flood of people into cooking schools, ergo all these people wanted to become emerald and coming out not being emerald, the one thing they were going to be able to do was go into restaurants and hotels with the most recent adaptations of inventory control and science. And their job was to decrease the amount of food donated to programs like the DC Central Kitchen. Now, I got to tell you, I loaded it on thick. You know, when we go to a restaurant, we would say, here's the deal. We'll show up when it's convenient for you. We'll provide the containers. We will give you a tax deduction. The drivers will be certified food handlers. We'll put it in a refrigerated truck. We'll give you a sign for your window so customers coming in know that you're the kind of business person who doesn't throw away food. Annually, we'll give you a cumulative total so that you and your accountant can determine how much money you're able to write off for donating to the DC Central Kitchen. We will decrease the amount of trash you have to throw away, subsequently the amount of money you have to pay for the trash companies, and also, and it's hard to say, but we will also decrease the amount of pest control money you have to spend, because we will take the organic trash that you would have thrown away and we will use it. We'll use it to feed the city, but we'll also use it to train men and women. And again, we will pay your kindness and your foresight with men and women who can show up on time. That's a pretty good roster of bennies, right? But the reality is their number one goal is to decrease the amount of food they give me in the first place, and that is inevitable. So here I was in 1996, 7, 8, starting to realize there's going to be less food and more people, you know? And this really started me thinking in a very big way. You know, and this kind of brings me to the third thing that I'd kind of, you know, kind of define myself at, which is a tactician. You know, as I suggested earlier, Americans are really decent people. They're kind. I mean, they give $300 billion a year to charity. You know, and they almost 90 million people a year volunteer. In fact, show of hands, anybody in the audience under 30 hands? Right on. You know, you're the biggest generation in the history of America. You know, there's 90 million people under 30. You're the most diverse generation in the history of our country. You know, you're the most technologically advanced by far. And you have been raised doing service. As a country, we've raised an entire generation doing service. You know, and again, I became very aware of these amazing opportunities. But, you know, what I saw is that people aren't bad, but they want to hold on really tight to these stereotypes. You know, they'd rather think that if you're poor in America, it's your fault. If you're in prison, you deserve it. If you're hungry, come on, just get a job. And they're nice people, they just don't want to let go. So I became really intrigued as a kid by the story of the Trojan Horse. You know, because, you know, my daughter was madly in love with Orlando Bloom during a long period of her life. And we watched every possible movie that had Orlando Bloom in it. And Troy, the movie, and most adaptations of that story make the siege of Troy look like a 3-day romp. It was a 10-year siege, 10 years long, historically. And every single day of those 10 years, Agamemnon, the Greek king, was correct. I mean, he was the aggrieved party. Paris, young man came to dinner, you know, split with another man's wife. Agamemnon, the Greeks, had every reason to be yanked off, you know. So, but they were outside the gates for those 10 years being right. And it took a young person, Odysseus, to come along and say, look, we've been using wood the traditional way, no disrespect, and we've used it every single way a good general king should. You have made no mistakes. It just hasn't worked. Let me have the wood, and let's try it a different way. And not only were they in the next day, but it was the Trojans' idea to let them in. And that's really what interests me, is how do you get people to let go of these fears, these stereotypes, so we can move over to this next time in America that I think the clock is ticking on. You know, as we come together today, you know, we're just weeks away from an election. And I must admit, this is where I'm really vexed right now, because I don't know if you've noticed this, but not one of the candidates has mentioned the word philanthropy, nonprofit, poverty. But let's go back to nonprofit. I find this really interesting because, you know, nonprofits, nonprofits in America, we're the third biggest employer in America. You know, we employ 10% of the workforce, and we're 10% of the economy. We have $3 trillion in assets, $300 billion in annual revenue, And we channel the energy, as I suggested earlier, between 70 and 90 million Americans annually. You know, just recently I was walking in Missoula, Montana. And as I walked down the street, I saw this big sign in the Chamber of Commerce window. And it's a town much like Roanoke here. You know, it's a beautiful town. People come through. You know, it's got a lot of activity. And the Chamber of Commerce had the top 10 reasons you can relocate your business and move your family and your employees to Missoula, Montana. And so I looked at that list. It's like, okay, I'll bite. And I went up and looked, and it was like, okay, first, access to quality health care. That's a nonprofit. Number 2, our higher education, nonprofit. Number 4, arts and culture, nonprofits. Number 6, our beautiful environment and walkways and green space. Again, I don't know how many of you all have been to Missoula, Montana, but there's a river runs through it, and it was horribly polluted until the EPA and local nonprofits got together, and it was one of the first Superfunds. And it's clean now because of the work of, again, government and nonprofits together. And then finally, number 10, communities of faith. And I was looking at it saying, the Chamber of Commerce is acknowledging in their own material that the reason you can come to Missoula and make money is because they have great nonprofit organizations. You know, and the awkward part, though, is those organizations then turn to the nonprofits who do all this great work that set the foundation for profit and say, in effect, thanks very much, here's some grants, but no politics. You know, when I walk to work every morning, to the DC Central Kitchen, I walk down Mount Pleasant Street, every single business walking down the street can have a sign saying, vote for this candidate, vote for that candidate. But if somebody, of the 14,000 volunteers who come through the DC Central Kitchen every year, I can't say, man, thank you for coming. Man, we tore it up today. We did 5,000 meals. And again, we do 5,000 meals 7-day weeks, 365. We've never closed. I can say, you can come here for 10,000 years, though. And we'll have a great time every day, but we'll never solve hunger this way. It's a really important thing we do here. Well, we can't solve it this way. But I can't say, but I would urge you to consider candidate A or candidate B, whose policies might usher in an era where we can get more people out of prison, more people working, less need for taxes. I can't say that. My tongue is tied by rules that govern nonprofits' ability to speak. So here I am in an environment in which I know the power that the nonprofit sector has to, again, create the foundation upon which profit is made. In fact, one of the statements I love to put out when we talk is there is no profit without nonprofits. You know, literally, you cannot make money in a town that doesn't have a dynamic, robust nonprofit sector. I defy you. It's called Death Valley. There is no profit without nonprofits. And what it's imperative right now, and this isn't necessarily for the benefit of nonprofit organizations, but for heaven's sakes, in my opinion, any candidate who talks to you about wanting your vote and talks about economic recovery and doesn't include their third biggest employer isn't a viable candidate, period. You know, this is business 101, and you got to understand, man, where I'm coming from. I don't do left-right. I don't do good-bad. I don't do right-wrong. I do smart-dumb. You know, and this is seriously dumb business. Now let's go back to this thing. I want to go back to the colleges. You know, I didn't go to, as I suggested, I didn't go to college, but because of the glory of commencement addresses, you are looking at Dr. Egger. Serious, man. You know, life is good. But you know what's interesting is, and I've done so many of these, and over the years I've been lucky. I've been interviewed because I was one of those, 10 people who get on C-SPAN who they record their addresses. And so I got a lot of calls from media saying, oh, we've talked to some of the other commencement addressers, and I assume because of your work, you're going to tell this younger generation and reinforce the need to give back. And I'm like, dude, anybody who asks this generation to give back has no clue about this generation. They've been raised doing service. This is a generation who does one for one. They buy Tom shoes. My generation, they'd say, bring your old dingy boots, and we'll give those to a poor person, and you can get a brand new pair. You know, this is a generation, I don't know how many of you all go up to D.C. and see bike share. This is a generation that's starting to say, why own a bike? I'll share. These are really powerful doors. But you know what we say? In effect, on graduation day, we're saying, in effect, congratulations. You know, you are graduating from what remains, for all its warts and scratches, one of the great education systems in the history of the world. And you've been raised doing service. But today, you got to choose. Do you want to make money, or do you want to do good deeds? Do you want to be a .com, or do you want to be a .org? You know? And if I was going to drop the F-bomb, this is where I'd say F the dot. Because this whole idea that we are limiting the imagination of young people to this abstract concept that you literally have to choose between integrity and a paycheck. You know, doing good and doing right. This is an absurd, almost intellectually barbaric manacles you're placing on a generation that should be surging out, exploring dynamic new business opportunities. And there's a million different names for them. Social enterprise, microcredit, you know, but there's a dynamic opportunity. And what I'd like to see us do is elect a generation of leaders. Next year, 2013, governor's race in Virginia, mayors, city council members. What we need to do is elect a generation of people who look at our young people coming out of college and say, dudes, what do I have to do to get you to double down on Roanoke? You know, what do I have to do to get you to your craziest idea? Because if you got an idea that'll create a job, if you got a business that will reinvest in this community, if you got a business that'll pay a living wage, if you got a business that has certifiable green policies, bring it on. You know, and we have to go out and elect people like that. Too many politicians are limited. They're not bad people by any stretch. In fact, just so you know, years ago, I got this, you can't see it probably, but I have a tattoo on this finger. And again, I apologize, but I spent so much of my youth doing this that I wanted to remind myself, dude, don't be a hater. Dude, do not be a hater, you know? And this is to remind myself that people aren't bad. It's very tempting to judge people. And this is my own little reminder, dude, don't judgy McJudge, don't go down that road, you know? But this idea of understanding that people aren't bad, but they're just burdened by these antiquated notions of profit. You know, we still live in this idea where we genuflect to this Milton Friedman stuff that suggests that the role of business is to make money for the investors, the number one goal. And we don't question that, it's sacred. But no one's come along and say, okay, well, let's just do the same one for consumers. It's the number one job of consumers to make sure that businesses reinvest as much money as possible in their community. You know, there's all kinds of options. And these are these doorways that interest me because I love what the DC Central Kitchen does. In fact, I've just announced that after 25 years, I am stepping aside as the head of the DC Central Kitchen. And I've done this for many reasons. Like many people in the human services world, I've asked poor people to step out, to try new things, to leave behind old behaviors, to be brave. Yet, very often, we don't do the same things ourselves. So I think it was important for me to show leadership. A leader doesn't create followers, a leader creates more leaders. And I was excited, and I remain really, really excited about the team that has over the years helped the kitchen become, we earn 60% of our own income, we are a $10 million a year machine, we do school food in the District of Columbia, we buy local source food from Mennonites in the Shenandoah Valley, which we use in one of the most interesting experiments in America, where we do locally sourced cook from scratch meals in 10 DC public schools and private schools. The kitchen, by any stretch, it's like, peace out, dudes, you got it. I'm going to Los Angeles, where I grew up, and I'm about to open the LA kitchen. Yep. You want to know why? Again, I know what's coming. A wave of seniors. Brothers and sisters, there's three kinds of leaders. There's three kinds of leaders. The majority of people have their heads down. I just got to do what I got to do. I got to keep the lights on. I got to get the dishes out of here. I just got to do this, you know? The second group are people just like you. And by the way, hey, before we go, can we say thank you to the servers today? Always say thank you to the men and women who... But the second kind of leader are people just like you. You get these rare moments, and you put your head up, you know, and you look above the din of everyday life, and you get to see something bigger, you know. Now, of the second group, the vast majority probably puts their head back down. And if some people hear about the future, a big hunk of them will brace and wait for the future to come to them. The third kind of leader, and this is what I aspire to, and I urge you to consider this for your own lives, I'm going to march out and meet the future. I refuse to accept that. I can do something today to potentially change that future. Now again, as I suggested earlier, I know what's coming. It is metaphorically called the Silver Tsunami. You know, every single morning, as much as I admire and really believe in the destiny of the millennials, the younger generation, at the same time, I also believe steadfastly in the destiny of my generation. You know, it's a wonder you can't put your head out the window and hear a sigh. Every morning, as 10,000 people look in the mirror, 66 years old. You know, every single morning, 10,000 people turn 66 every single morning. And it's a wonder, like I said, you can't hear that sigh. As 10,000 people look in the mirror and say, how did I get so lost? How did I get so tricked into thinking if I just bought more stuff, I'd be happy? You know? And this is, and I want to really emphasize, this is going to be the deepest well of life experience in the history of the world. No other generation has been this free, this rich, this educated, and will live this long. The potential resources of our elders in America is too great, too precious a resource to ignore. Yet tragically, just as we wasted food, we still waste people. So what I want to do is take what is in effect the Mount Everest-sized mountain of fruit and produce that's thrown away every single day in Southern California. You know, we throw away about 40% of the food we produce every single day, and over half of that is fruit and vegetables. Now you can see what's coming a million miles away is a generation of seniors are going to go with their smartphone to the doctor and say, okay, I have what illness, and you're giving me what medication, wait, I take these pills, that won't work. But they're going to say, when somebody shows up with that Meals on Wheels and says, here's your Salisbury steak and your mashed potatoes and your succotash and your peach cobbler, they're going to look at that and say, that's going to kill me. I can't eat that. So what I want to pioneer is the beginning of a vegetarian, vegan approach to serving our elders locally sourced fruits and vegetables while we train unemployed men and women for work, while we also create jobs. It's going to be a dynamic new machine, and I urge you to keep your eyes out for it. It's called, again, LA Kitchen. It'll open in 2013. I'm going back to the town of my roots. My wife and I, I'm sure some of the people in the audience can relate to this. My wife and I woke up one morning, we looked at each other and said, dude, we're like 50-year-old empty nesters. You know, it's like, wow, when did that happen? But these are the best years of our lives, man, and we're serious livers. You know, so we're going to go out and just completely rock our 50s and 60s. So pay attention, man. We're going to tear it up. But as bold as I can be, and I will work to make this as dynamic and as exciting as I can, I know in the end, I will only invest 49% of my time here. I really metaphorically split my attention 49-51 because I know at the end of the day, no matter how powerful I do this, this isn't the solution. But if I do it right, I can use this as a Trojan horse, and what I can maybe do is start to bring people in so that instead of talking about how we feed our elders who are poor, we can start to talk about how do we value all of our elders and begin that dynamic discussion. But this really centers around our ability as a country to, again, let go of these old notions of .com, .org, and start to elect people, as I say this over again. I also have a political action committee. And you know, one of the things we did, and I'm not trying to mimic the behavior of a super PAC. I have no interest in that. I don't know how many of you know about Kiva, but Kiva is in effect an online tool that allows you to research and see who needs what out there. All I've done is I got an army of interns, and this year we data mined, and we found 70 men and women who have worked in nonprofits. They're people just like me and just like many of you. They've sweated payroll. They've worked hard because they believe in their town, and now they're stepping up to run for city council, mayor, governor, you know, state legislature. And all I've done is say, here's 70. You know, here's a way in which you, as a nonprofit employee, a legal way in which you can identify people who work in just like you, who, if they are elected, will stand up in state legislatures or city hall or in the mayor's office, and when somebody starts proposing sometimes well-intended but short-sighted laws that will try and get the short-term gain and miss the long-term opportunity, they can stop and at least say time out. These are men and women who might propose really interesting new policies, and let me tell you one. You want a big idea? Who wants a big idea? Okay, here you go. In 1986, Muhammad Yunus, is an American-trained economist, but he's from Bangladesh. And just as you love Roanoke or Virginia, and I love D.C., and soon to be L.A., he loves Bangladesh. But Bangladesh, as many of you all know, has perennially been one of the poorest countries in the planet. Well, he was visiting, and he was out in a rural village, and he met a group of women. And they were lamenting the fact that they were all but indentured to moneylenders. And he stopped and they made conversation. He said, you know, how much? How much do you owe the moneylenders? And the women went over and they talked amongst themselves and came back and said, $27. Now, like most people, he's like, oh, I got that right here. And I urge you to think about this, because he stopped. He stopped and he thought. And he thought, you know, anybody else would give this money and assumed that they had liberated these women. You know, they'd take a picture, put it on their Facebook page. What'd you do this summer? Liberate a village, dude. What'd you do? You know? But he's like, I'm an economist. I know better. You know, if I give them this money, I will only buy them momentary freedom. You know, and he stopped and he thought, you know, sisters, the only reason, you know, you're in this situation is you don't have access to capital. And I don't see any reason that the entrepreneurial spirit doesn't burn just as bright in your heart as it does any man in any other country. So I'll tell you what, who wants to start a business? And I will loan you the money to launch a business. And then you can pay the moneylender back, and you can pay me back, and then you're truly free. Now, in 1996, Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize for elevating conservatively about 75 million people out of poverty, primarily women, with small loans. Now, in 1986, if you had given Bill Gates $1,000 when he launched Microsoft and it went public, you would have $1 million in the bank today. $1 million. But if you had given Muhammad Yunus $1,000 in 1986, when he was beginning the Grameen Foundation and the Grameen Bank, all you would have been eligible for was a one-time tax deduction because you gave to a charity. Now, why not an annual tax deduction with increasing value based on the same rate of return principle as a dividend check if a nonprofit organization can show verifiable economic return on investment? That's just a policy. But imagine the potential of being able to invest in Roanoke and attaining wealth. Imagine what that would do to incentivize the nonprofit sector to leave some of them the world of service and begin to adapt the idea of empowerment. Imagine the opportunities. That's just a policy, brothers and sisters. That's just electing people who aren't burdened, again, by old attitudes about how we make profit in America. You know, there's so many different opportunities we have, but I urge you today, because again, I know I'm the last of many speakers, and I know you've been overwhelmed with amazing opportunities, but I think what unites all of us who were humbled to stand on the stage before you is our fervent belief, you know, that we can, in fact, make the world a better place. It's tough. It's hard work. You know, when I practice a thing I lovingly call relentless incrementalism, you know, sometimes we get tricked into thinking it's got to be a big thing, you know. People, for young people, when you go home and you say to your parents, you know, I want to work at a nonprofit, and I guarantee that you're going to hear that universal, you know, why don't you go become a lawyer or a doctor, make some money and give it back? And they're just falling into this Carnegie trap, which says, you know, the goal is you make a whole bunch of money in your life, and then you try and give some back at the end of your life to offset the damage you did making a whole bunch of money in your life. And that model just doesn't work. You know, what I believe the future is going to be, philanthropy is going to be a little bit of how you spend your money every day. You know, it's going to be the way you make your money. There's so many different opportunities. But that's the glory of this country. You know, this is what people fought and died for. The notion that no generation has to necessarily adhere to the rules and regulations of the previous generation. It's every generation's right to redraw the lines, to remake the rules. And that's all we've talked to you about today. It's just, if I can add any one thing, it's just, I think all of us on the stage, and I think many people in this room, get great joy out of tilting our head just a little bit and seeing the world just a little bit differently. You know, it's just walking down the street and seeing things others don't. If I can give one bit of advice to young people in the audience, and anybody in particular, I grew up loving music. I believe so fervently in its power. But I urge you, if you truly want to make change in the world, unplug. Unplug and listen to your town. You know, you'll never truly be able to change a town unless you hear it, you feel it, you experience it. You know, so I just urge you to really jump into life on a daily basis, see the world a little bit differently, believe in yourself, believe in the power of small incremental change, and never stop, ever, kicking ass and taking names. Thank you all very, very much.